Badiou and Roudinesco offer many intriguing insights into Lacan's personality and thought. However, with a few exceptions, this book is not much more than an introductory romp into the intellectual environs and theoretical reception of Lacan's psychoanalysis. Nevertheless, it does offer a few interesting tidbits, even for well-versed readers. The book's main thrust is a defense of Lacan and psychoanalysis, even from its own self-domestication, as Roudinesco puts it. Badiou raises the stakes further by intimating that the very survival of psychoanalysis is in question. The contemporary charges against psychoanalysis seem to me still more grave than those leveled at Marxism. Marxism presupposes and implies a fight. What is happening today with psychoanalysis is much more dangerous. We must be on high alert, because wanting to eradicate Freud or Lacan is to go after the very concept of the modern subject, and if that is abolished, the door is open to reactionary ideologies of the worst sort. At a relatively early point in the dialogue, Badiou seizes on the description of Lacan as the learning of psychoanalysis, arguing that Lacan builds on Freud in the same way that learning built on Marx. Badiou says, Lacan compared himself to learning, while comparing Freud to Marx, with these more or less metaphorical associations. He wanted to emphasize that Freud was still situated in the medical logic of the cure, and Marx in the posture of a promise. Now that he no longer promises communism, he decides, he acts, he organizes. Badiou shows that in many ways, Lacan's works are not ipso facto political, but rather that it emerges from grounds that are themselves extremely political. Lacan decides, acts, and organizes, but what the Lacanian cure offers is not comparable to the medical logic of the Freudian cure. Of course, this comes as no surprise to those well-versed in Lacan's thought. However, the political context of the Lacanian cure is essential for Badiou's characterization of Lacan. The Lacanian cure, even though it is totally apolitical in its own specific exercise, proposes for thought a political matrix. All the same, Badiou's Lacan is a Leninist, insofar as he manipulates the political context to achieve not what Freud had desired in the cure, but rather a cure that uncovers the profound sense which aims at an opening up of the subject in relation to an original state of powerlessness. Badiou's reading of Lacan, though perhaps faithful to Lacan's own view of himself, runs contrary to contemporary debates which attempt to place Lacan directly in line with Marx. Render in Lacan as not totally apolitical, as Badiou would have it. For example, Samotomai argues in Psychoanalysis, Capitalism, and the Critique of Political Economy that Lacan's use of formalization stands in direct continuity with Marx's dialectical method. It is in relation to subjectivity that Badiou recounts his sympathetic reception of Lacan's work on his own thinking at the start of his career. Badiou explains how, in the early 60s, he was at a particular conjuncture, and that although he was a committed Sartrean, he was inculcated with the help of Althusser into breaking with phenomenology. Badiou's desire was to maintain the concept of the subject in his philosophy, unlike the hard structuralists like Foucault or the Heideggerians such as Derrida, who consider the category of the subject to be the mere avatar of a defunct metaphysics. For Badiou, Lacan wants to preserve the subject and renew it from the ground up. Of course, The Latinian subject is no longer recognizable. As Ba explains, it is certainly subjugated to the signifying chain. It is divided, unbeknownst to itself, split, exposed to a radical alterity, but it is this early gesture, that of preserving the subject, that Ba claims drew him towards Latin. Latin allowed me to align myself with the theoretical anti-humanism of the period, while remaining faithful to my Sartrean youth, and to the notion of the subject. Flitting back and forth throughout Latin's career, both authors suggest that the Latinian cure is something that Latin offers and then slowly begins to take away, which they both stress is unprecedented in the history of French thought. Roudinesco argues, and Badiou agrees, that it was fascinating to see this man undoing his own thought in public. Latin's final gesture, the dissolution, was, for Roudinesco, a gesture that is unheard of, deeply subversive, like fire or provocation, final blow leveled at his supposed theoretical omnipotence. For Ba, the enigma that Lacan presents in his later seminars could be represented with the characteristics of Oedipus at Colonus. He continues a situation where a man undoes by himself the knot of his own existence, and imposes on whoever listens to him this terminal, final unraveling. There is a clear sense from both Badiou and Roudinesco that the theatricality in Latin's seminars, his obvious attempts to formulate his theory in incremental yearly steps, was something that he intended to continue until his death. Roudinesco agrees, at the end of his life, Lacan transformed into Oedipus at Colonus, even physically. In his walk and his gestures, he was engaged in a gigantic process of dissolution. Ba says that this posture is, to be sure, in certain ways obscure, spectral, but it reveals and condenses the tragedy itself of the subject. Latin's project is very fruitful for philosophy, Ba argues. We will never finish interrogating this man and his thought. What was it about really, at bottom? Psychoanalysis. Obviously, philosophy. Yes, in a certain sense. The idea that Lacan volunteered the undoing of his own thought is relatively commonplace. Slavage eks less than nothing explains that Lacan had formulated a certain deadlock. In his very late seminars, the Borromine knot demonstrates Lacan's inability to fully close the circle of his arguments. Here Lacan, at the very end of his teaching, reached a deadlock to which, in an authentically tragic mode, he openly confessed an admission of total defeat. What we learn from Baron Roudinesco is no elaboration of how or why this tragic moment occurs in Lacan's teaching, neither in technical nor in more general terms. We get entertaining slogans which invite questions and spark one's curiosity. Ba says, I imagine the late Lacan as someone who continues to point his finger at an unsayable real. Except that in the end, we can no longer know what this gesture indicates and truly implies. It is left to us as an enigma, like death itself. The elucidation of Lacan's thought is achieved, with great accuracy, by both authors elsewhere. Here, however, we are simply left to enjoy the ruminations of the two towering figures of the French contemporary intellectual scene. Ba explains his affinity with Maoism. Today, we can only say that Mao was part of a great revolutionary history, just like Robespierre, Saint-Just, Blanqui, Trotsky, Lenin, and many others. But he disagrees with Roudinesco's view. that Lacanese thought has a propensity to proliferate revolutionary history. It stems, in fact, from the Lacanian concept of the subject, to which it is completely coherent, if not necessary, to give, via philosophy, a subversive political dimension. The passage from a Lacan who says, "Do not give up on your desire," to a Mao who says, "You were right to rebel," was for us perfectly clear. However, in this book, we never move beyond the statements or slogans, which was perhaps the heroic aim of the project. From the very start,